Okay. All right. I've started the recording and I'll begin the talk. Thank you all for joining me today in my doctoral defense presentation. I'm excited and slightly nervous to present my work that examines the role of socio-technical systems in supporting a vulnerable population. The particular context of my work involves anti-trafficking organizations in Nepal and the sex trafficking survivors who live in the organization's shelter home. In Nepal, survivors of sex trafficking are vulnerable due to various reasons. They face many barriers in their reintegration journey. A major barrier is that they have very limited resources. Survivors are typically from poor and marginalized families. Anti-trafficking efforts have received limited political priority. In fact, Nepal government has been repeatedly criticized for its lack of action on this front. In this space, non-governmental anti-trafficking organizations are the major actors. The deeply ingrained patriarchal values that is present in Nepali society also forms another major barrier in reintegration. The survivors face significant social stigma, leading many to be shunned by their families and their communities. Patriarchal beliefs can be seen embodied in bureaucratic processes, such as in obtaining citizenship certificate, which adds further challenges to the reintegration process. The goal for the survivors is to achieve what they call dignified reintegration. Through our research, we aim to understand how we can design socio-technical systems that can assist a vulnerable group, in our case, survivors of trafficking, to move towards their own goals, which in our case is their vision of dignified reintegration. More specifically, in my research, I asked 3 questions. First, I wanted to understand the conditions that influence the survivor's situation in the shelter home. The second question sheds light on the factors that influence the possibilities for us to engage with the survivors and the anti-trafficking organizations. In this talk, I'll mostly focus on this question and will particularly highlight 4 key methodological considerations that came up during our engagement. Third, I take a reflexive position to examine how we can ensure that the voices of the vulnerable are heard, especially in a sensitive setting like ours. In today's talk, I'll present 4 things. First, I'll present a brief overview of existing human-computer interaction work with and for vulnerable population. I shall then introduce our assets-based approach that we took as part of our engagement in Nepal. I will then highlight 4 key contributions of our work to the growing body of assets-based design scholarship within HCI. Finally, I'll reflect on our engagement to draw out key elements during our work. I'll now begin with the first part of the talk. A significant body of HCI research has examined vulnerability and ways to support vulnerable groups. Particularly influential to our work is Massimi et al.'s exploration of technology to support people who have experienced life disruptions and are trying to move towards a new normal. They raise 3 design considerations. First, paying attention to the changing social relationship. Second, considering the vulnerability of the existing infrastructure for support. And third, upholding dignity, privacy, and safety during times of when they're experiencing life disruptions. We endorse these values, but we also believe that life disruption implies a baseline with greater stability than what the survivors in Nepal have. Literature also emphasizes issues of isolation and several intersecting constraints faced by vulnerable communities. Broadly, HCI scholarship argues for designing for and with the community. We also endorse this belief. But how should we work with communities? Post-colonial computing urges us to pay attention to how the communities are included in the design process, what elements of their situation are considered, and how are those considerations translated into design. From literature, we find that there are 2 main approaches that influence how we go on about engaging, articulating, and translating with the communities. The first approach focuses on the community's needs and the deficits, and seeks ways to fulfill the needs or the deficits present. The second approach focuses on the assets such as resources and local knowledge already available to the community to bring about change. Need-focused approaches are guided by the community's needs and are assessed based on how much of the population's needs have been met. The approach is quite common in international development work and can also be seen embodied in, for example, human-centered design's need-finding exercise. However, it is argued that focusing exclusively on needs or deficits can perpetuate dependency and rob agency from actors who can bring about change. In contrast, assets-based approaches focus on the assets such as strengths, resources, and knowledge already available to the community members. As Alison Matthey and others argue, taking such an approach encourages power within, power to, and power with, and resists having power over the community. Interest in assets-based approaches have been growing within HCI. The key in assets-based approach is to identify the assets possessed by the community and seek ways to build upon it. In our work, we adapted an asset-based approach. I will now move on to the second part where I will describe our adaptation of the assets-based approach to fit our context. Through the first research question, I wanted to understand the conditions influencing the survivors' lives in the shelter home. For that, I began with an ethnographic study of the two largest anti-trafficking organizations in Nepal. One of them I shall call Professional Organization, or PO. The other organization was founded by survivors of trafficking, and many staff members at different levels are survivors. I shall call this second organization Survivor-Led Organization, or SO. Please note that I will call the survivors we worked with sisters or sister survivors in this talk. Through the initial ethnographic study, we found that the organizations were reliant on donors, mostly international donor agencies, for resources to run their programs. The reliance has several implications, one of which is that since the organizations are competing for limited grants, it had promoted practices that involved highlighting the survivors' deficiencies and their problems. We also noticed that the organizations had varying definition of what constituted a successful reintegration. Findings from our study also highlight the limited prospects for the sisters in Nepal. Both the NGOs provided training in creating local handicrafts, but the handicrafts had limited demand in the local market. The sisters also reported feeling pain when the NGOs had asked them to recall their past as part of, for example, writing grant proposals to the donor organizations. During the interviews, the sisters also shared concerns about the stigma they see in society against trafficking survivors. In general, we find that the sisters are dependent on the organization, but at the same time, the organization is also dependent on the sisters. These findings influenced our approach moving forward. There were multiple perspectives on what constituted a successful reintegration. Critical among them was the belief that successful reintegration would require the sisters to be empowered to engage with societal actors and institutions. However, the deficiency perspective was also prominent, but it did not support the sisters' agency and power to engage with societal actors and institutions. So instead, we sought to push back on it by adapting an assets-based approach. Further, the sisters did not want to recall their past. So all of our approaches have focused on their present life in the shelter home and their visions of the future. The interdependence between the organization and the sisters led us to develop ways to carefully balance multiple goals. We sought to include the staff members throughout the decision-making process. After the first study, I could not build a relationship with the professional organization. All the subsequent studies that I talk here have been with only these survivor-led organization. As we adapt asset-based approaches, questions emerge on what constitutes an asset. From literature, we find that assets are varied and multiple. It can either be tangible things such as low-tech systems to support a community, or intangible things such as care practices in low-resource learning centers. In this space, Wong-Villacres et al. Present a useful analytical lens to identify assets. They argue that the strategies people develop from their cultural resources can be the lens to understand what assets are valuable to the population and also amenable to design. While it is a useful lens, we cannot use it in our work. As we heard in our initial ethnographic study, many of the sisters do not want to recall their past. Moreover, they are often coming to conceptualize and value a radically different future than what they had previously, a life that is without their birth families. To fit our context, we came up with a more precise definition of assets that focused on how the assets could be used in a situation like ours. The first element in this definition that I want to draw your attention to is the part that focuses on who is bringing forth and saying which assets matter. Even though our research is community-based, we, the researchers, are the ones identifying and establishing what assets are of value. We also acknowledge that we are working with a wicked problem where assets alone cannot solve the problem. Rather, our engagement involves finding a balance between multiple tensions that result in solutions that are good enough. These tensions emerge from the population's needs, their aspirations, and the structural limitations of the system. It may seem conflicting that we have needs in the definition of assets. We want to acknowledge that assets are valuable because they meet an end, and that includes meeting the needs of the population. Along with the definition, we came up with an evolving framework that guided our action. We limited the scope of our action to individual and institutional change. Our actions can influence changes by engaging directly with the participants or indirectly by creating space for the participants to reflect on and use their assets. A component of our studies involved supporting participants to reflect on their assets and develop critical awareness about it. A question that emerged during that engagement was, in order to support reflection, how can we design methods to identify those assets? Another component involved supporting participants to use their assets and build capabilities that challenge the deficiency perspective present in the setting. A challenge here was to identify a way to build upon the existing assets. Assets are valuable in the sense that they support people to realize their aspirations while addressing the limitations they face. To that end, we believe it's important for participants to leverage their existing assets to explore broader possibilities and alternatives. The question, though, is how can we support participants to do so? Finally, an inclusive and supportive space is required for the participants to reflect, use, and build upon their assets. This necessitates mitigating power differences between the stakeholders to foster a space to collectively engage with the assets. A question that emerged during our engagement was, how can we increase inclusion within the organization to support in creating an enduring asset-focused community? Ways in which we address these 4 questions constitute a contribution of our work. Now, here are the 4 questions, and I shall begin with the first question. Now, during the initial ethnographic study, I noticed that there was a distance between me and the sisters. As a male coming from the US to conduct a research study in a primarily female setting, I stood out. I also noticed that the staff members often rephrased the questions I asked and also answered on behalf of the sisters. Further, I used words like project and research as part of the IRB consent process, which added to the distance. I felt I was hearing some of the voices, but not completely. I needed to hear the nuanced voices by reducing the distance. During my field visits, I saw posters created by the sisters around both the organization's walls. Posters like these contained cutouts from newspapers and text written to generate public awareness. This suggested that the sisters were familiar with printed photos and posters for self-expression. So to reduce the distance, I adapted photo elicitation method. I hypothesized that the playful experience would help reduce the distance while promoting reflection on their assets. I handed over an instant print camera with multiple films to the sisters. I requested them to take photos of anything they wanted for the next 2 days without establishing any particular goal. 2 days later, we convened to discuss all the photos they had taken. Instead of only the photographer speaking about the photo, everyone shared what the photos meant to them. At the end of each round of discussion, the sisters came up with a communally agreed statement to describe the photo and wrote it down on the poster, as you can see here, written in Nepali. The study uncovered two elements of strengths possessed by the sisters. The first was their crafting skills. All of the sisters were learning the skills as part of SO's reintegration program. Crafting skills are culturally acceptable and has potential to generate income. However, the sisters and the staff members were aware that the sale of the handicrafts was declining in the local market. Some of the sisters also found crafting to be difficult and boring. They expressed a desire to try new things. Similarly, during the study, I had noticed a strong bond between the sisters. The shared living situation, the awareness of the past, the shared work, and the mutual support they provided each other had fostered a strong bond between them. The mutual bond can be a source of social support moving forward. However, the sisters also noted that they may lose the connection after leaving the shelter home when they move out across the country. Through this exercise, we can draw out 4 key aspects that supported us in promoting reflections on the assets. First, building on the activities that the sisters were familiar with helped in creating a space of comfort for the sisters to participate. The photo elicitation activity further made the familiar strange. The sisters saw their surrounding through a new lens, literally through a camera in this case. Second, the physical print of the Polaroid camera was critical in the process. It helped convey that the sisters had full control over the photos. They could discard the photo or even burn it if they did not like it. By making the activity communal, we supported collective reflection on their lives. This drew out diverse perspectives on the assets. Finally, by making it a collective activity, we reduced the chance of individuals feeling like they are on the hook to speak. It supported the sisters to have control over their participation with us. Now that we've identified some of the assets, the second question is, how do we build upon it? And I'll highlight how we did so by presenting how we built on the sisters' crafting practices and their mutual bond. First, despite its problem, crafting is a valuable asset in this setting. For the sisters, crafting is accessible and culturally acceptable. Some of the sisters also mentioned that crafting has had therapeutic value for them. Crafting was presented to them as a future possibility by the organization, and some of the sisters also saw it as being part of their future. From the organization's perspective, they have already invested in setting up the handicraft workshop. They have also hired trainers to provide training as well. Crafting constitutes an important part of SO's rehabilitation program. Critically, the organization has limited resources, including human resources, to try new things. From our perspective, this group of sisters living in the shelter home changed in each of our study. However, we could rely on the sisters being familiar with crafting even when the group changes. We also believe that the knowledge of crafting can lead to more enduring strengths, and that's what we explored in this work. When we shared the findings after identifying those 2 assets with 3 of the staff members, they shared different approaches to build on the assets. For example, they suggested providing a photography lesson or designing a mobile app for the sisters to learn new skills. As you can see in the list here, a technological component was present in all of their suggestions. They saw technology as a valuable component in our continuing co-engagement. it was aspirational to the organization. But when we think about introducing technologies, we have to plan ways to overcome constraints like limited digital and text literacy. From the initial ethnographic study, we learned that none of the sisters had access to computers or mobile phones. None of them were attending schools, and only 3 of the 9 I interviewed reported being comfortable enough to read a simple SMS text. Moreover, ASO had introduced computers and Photoshop to some of the sisters earlier. The sisters had found that experience to be overwhelming, as we can hear in S3's statement, who said that she had never touched a laptop before to know what to do with it. This experience had eroded their sense of self-belief when it came to technology. Despite the prior experience, the sisters expressed a desire to learn computers, especially to communicate with family and friends. Considering the sisters' wishes and the NGO's aspirations for technology, we decided to move forward with computing. However, simply introducing computers has the potential of undermining the existing assets. Rather, I introduced computing in the context of the sisters' crafting practices. I developed a web application called Hamro Kala, which means our craft in Nepali. The web application was contextualized around crafting, allowing the sisters to draw sketches of the crafts, post details of the crafts, and also look at other people's crafts and post comments. The sisters could share the crafts and drawings with their community and receive audio comments on them. We hypothesized that contextualizing the web application around crafting would help in introducing computing, but also in supporting the sisters to critically reflect on their existing assets. Further, to build on the sisters' mutual bond, I added features that promoted social interaction. For example, in addition to posting crafts for sale, the sisters could share their crafts within their community and receive audio comments on it. The application supported them to leave audio comments on the shared craft as well. Similarly, drawings could be shared, copied, modified, and reshared with their community. To overcome barriers due to limited text literacy, I embedded voice annotation on all the elements of Hamrokala. A female voice shared an elaborate description of the element as a user hovered over it. Moreover, phrases common in digital parlance, such as login and logout, which are also commonly used in Nepali websites, held little meaning to the sisters. Instead, we used elaborate phrases in the voice annotation. For example, instead of saying logout in Nepali, the web application said, "To leave this technology, press here." Technology alone is not enough, though. The way it is introduced and how it is positioned is critical and requires careful consideration. I conducted a 10-day workshop for a group of 9 sisters to introduce computers and Hamrokala. Each session ran for around 2 hours. On the final day, the sisters were paired with a staff member to whom they explained what they had done during the workshop. This was done both to see how much the sisters had understood the web system and more critically to promote a sense of ownership over the web application and support the sisters to showcase their skills. Throughout the workshop, mutual support was observed. As seen in the layout here, the sisters could see what others were doing and they moved around asking or providing help. The voice annotation further helped make the activities perceptible to the group. Overall, the sisters were able to use Hamrokala and created a large volume of digital artifacts. Over the course of the session, they expressed growing confidence in using computers and the web application. Many stayed beyond the 2 hours to use computers. We also observed that the sisters negotiated practice in the space and decided how computers are to be used. They expressed joy in being able to share their work as well. On the final day, the staff members expressed astonishment with what the sisters were able to do with the computers. Now, being able to explain one web application is not a lot, but the staff members' astonishment reflects how low the bar had been established because of the prior failure of the NGO in introducing computers. Through the workshop, we were able to create a space for the sisters to critically reflect on their assets. The activities drew forth discussions around the effort required and the selling price of their handicrafts. These discussions suggest that it furthered their understanding of crafting within the broader context of SO's operations. At the same time, they also expressed having limited control over their crafting practices. Later on, when I presented this finding to another group of sisters, they used that information to negotiate with the trainers to gain more control over their crafting practice. The success of the 10-day workshop, as perceived by the staff members, led to discussion on the possibility of training the sisters to become computer trainers in the future. It positioned the sisters as individuals who could master a difficult skill, that of using computers. By showcasing their capabilities of successfully using computers, the sisters were able to push back on some of the prevalent limiting belief. A new opportunity had opened up that stemmed from their capabilities. For the sisters, the workshop led to envisioning the possibility of pursuing office jobs with more computer training. The sisters' successful adoption, adaptation, and appropriation of technology led us to believe that knowledge of computing could be an asset. It could support the sisters to amplify their other assets, such as crafting, and be at a position of slightly greater power when they leave the shelter home. From this exercise, we learned 3 lessons on building upon existing assets. First, designing technology and the activities around it to support the sisters in overcoming their challenges, fears, and doubts were valuable. Second, the activities promoted a room for the sisters to use and experiment with different aspects of their assets, which helped in building upon it. Related to it, we believe that encouraging collective reflection of the assets allowed multiple perspectives to emerge. It facilitated deeper reflection on the asset's potential as well as its limitations. So far, we've discussed ways in which we were able to identify assets and a way to build upon those assets. Going back to our definition of assets, we contend that assets are valuable in that they support the individual's aspirations within the limitations they face. Key to it is to support the individuals to explore broader possibilities and alternatives. To do so, in our third engagement in the fieldwork, we extended the Hamrokala workshop. The activities began with a replication of the Hamrokala workshop, since the group was different than the earlier one. It is worth noting here that unlike the earlier group, all the sisters in this group had just started attending a public school and were between the grades of 1 to 7. 7 of the 10 sisters who participated in the study were comfortable reading Nepali. This group's higher level of literacy was an additional asset. Now, this may not be present in the future, but it was present in the current context, and we could build upon it. We extended the Hamrokala study in 3 main ways. First, we expanded on the sisters' technical skills and their higher literacy levels to introduce widely available systems like Google Search and Wikipedia, which we thought would be valuable once they leave the shelter home. Second, we presented ways in which they could use their skills, including their technical skills, to find out more about the world. Third, off the screen, we designed activities to support the sisters to chart avenues for their interactions with societal actors and institutions. We found a similar outcome in terms of technology adoption and appropriation. This group was more prolific though. They also negotiated practices in the space, suggesting the development of agency around technology. Critically, we learned that technology was acceptable, welcomed, and attainable for this group. We sought to build further on it incrementally. Like the previous group, the sisters wanted to use computers and the internet. We discussed the basics of internet and ways to remain safe on it by drawing parallels from their everyday life. Following this, the sisters used the internet on their own for 2.5 days. During the unstructured internet use time, the sisters helped one another, often collectively coming up with keywords to search for. Seeing this, I designed an activity around Google search. But instead of searching individually, I asked the sisters to collectively come up with keywords to find answers to a given question. We began with a set of 7 questions to search on Google. These questions were based on the sisters' internet use practices, such as finding the name of the author of a cartoon that they were watching. I also introduced Google Translate so that they could translate the keywords from Nepali to English before searching on Google. This activity drew deep engagement, so we expanded it further by asking each of the 10 sisters to come up with a question for the group to work on. They were, at the end of the session, they were able to find answers to all the 17 questions that we came up with. The search result often led to English Wikipedia pages, which required additional translation. These led to moments of frustration, and the sisters wanted to translate those English for others to use as well, others who could not read English. So I built an activity on top of the Google search exercise to design around Wikipedia editing. In this activity, the sisters translated a portion of the English Wikipedia article that were of their interest, such as about their hometowns or an aspired profession. They interpreted the translated content. The interpretation was required because Google Translate was not accurate, and in the process, it encouraged active reading. The sisters then compared the content with existing content on Nepali Wikipedia pages. Many of those pages did not exist, and others were small stocks. So they could add new information that they got from the translation to the Nepali Wikipedia page. Over the sessions, the sisters created and edited 10 Wikipedia articles, 4 of which were published, and as of today morning, they still exist live on Nepali Wikipedia. The Wikipedia editing activity seeded discussions on alternative futures and broader possibilities. For instance, a discussion ensued on the academic trajectory and effort required to achieve their primary aspiration. A sister who was in 7th grade wanted to become an accountant. She worked on translating the Chief Financial Officer page on Wikipedia, where the article discussed different degrees required to become a CFO. This led to a discussion where we covered the courses that she needed to take in her 10th grade, the programs that she could enroll after her 10th grade, and the colleges in Nepal she could join for a bachelor's in accounting. Having worked with Hamro Kala, we realized that we'd not yet situated the technology they had learned within the broader context of their lives. In particular, we had not yet explored how the sisters could interact with other actors in society and how technology and their other assets could play a role in facilitating or hindering their interactions. To that end, we introduced a future envisioning exercise that elicited values around 6 aspects of their lives that you can see here. I asked them to envision their future at 3 different milestones: at the time when they leave the shelter home, when they feel they have become successful, and when they feel that they have become old. We discussed their visions of the future as a group, drawing out different ways in which they could use their assets in the future. Critically, though, the sisters did not see many opportunities for themselves to act with societal actors and institutions. To explore further and envision ways for them to engage with societal actors and institutions, we designed a discussion around 2 problems that they had mentioned being common in their hometowns. These were child marriage and human trafficking. The discussion drew forth how their knowledge could be used in engaging with local actors. For instance, they expressed the need to engage with other people like teachers and the police, and saw potential to use their knowledge and skills to raise awareness among the community members. The sisters' formal education influenced how they used computers and what they valued. By incrementally designing the activities, we were able to build upon the sisters' existing assets, including their higher literacy, to engage in exploring widely available systems and with it the broader possibilities in the future. For instance, building on the Hamro Kala workshop and the higher literacy levels that they had, we arrived at Wikipedia editing activity. In addition to the academic commitment required, the activity drew forth pragmatic concerns such as ways to finance their higher education. The sisters discussed the possibility of working part-time in an office job to earn a living while studying. They saw knowledge of computing, especially that of typing, to be valuable to that end. Further, by situating their assets, including their technological skills, in the broader context through future envisioning exercise, as well as the discussion on societal problems, helped the sisters to reflect on the potential and limitations of their assets moving forward. We believe that these envisionments of engagement constitute power, one that could help the sisters to achieve dignified reintegration in the long run. A critical aspect remains within the institution, where the sisters could use and build upon their assets. However, for such an approach to be sustainable, we believe that we need to take a step back and foster an inclusive space within the institution for the sisters' assets to be appreciated and used. To this end, I began by interviewing 8 staff members at SO after the first wave of COVID-19 lockdown in Nepal. The goal was to understand the staff members' perspective on the reintegration services and to explore the potential of involving the sisters more in the organizational work. All of the staff members shared that the organization's biggest asset was that it was run by survivors. They shared pride in being part of the first survivor-led anti-trafficking organization in the world. The technical staff also expressed interest in mentoring survivors to become staff members. The staff members were also worried that SO was not successful in quote-unquote resource mobilization, that is, in supporting survivors to become staff members. At the same time, we heard clear and explicit differences between member staff, that is, people who are survivors of trafficking and are now part of the staff team, and technical staff, people who are professionals working in a non-profit. All the projects at SO were designed and implemented by technical staff members. None of the member staffs have yet handled projects. This difference between the member staff and the technical staff embodies the power differences between the staff members and the survivors. One way for the sisters to use and showcase their assets is by being involved in the organization's operations. The staff members also wanted this, but they had not yet found it to be possible. So in our interviews, we began discussing the barriers in bringing the sisters in the organization's project design process. Now, project design is one of the organization's core activities that involves writing projects which are submitted to the grant agencies. During the discussion, both the technical staff as well as member staff mentioned individual and organizational barriers. Individual barriers included the fact that many of the survivors lack education to contribute to project design. Further, the staff members shared their concern that survivors may not know how to help or that they may not be able to think beyond their own immediate problems. This shows how deeply ingrained the deficit perspective was within the organization and also among survivors of trafficking. The staff members also hinted at organizational barriers. These included the fact that since the technical staff members already involved member staff as consultants during the project design process, and since member staffs are survivors of trafficking, they are effectively including the sisters in the project design process. Some of the staff members mentioned the technical challenges and the lack of precedence in bringing everyone into the process. Some other staff members hinted at organizational inertia for SO to change processes that had been working so far. They also shared that SO was heavily reliant on donors and that change may put the organization at risk. Before the study got shut by the second wave of COVID-19, we had begun discussing different ways to include the sisters in the project design process. We eventually co-designed a modified form of Snakes and Ladders, a game that is quite popular in Nepal. Some of you may recognize this as chutes and ladders, which is what they call it in the US. Within a playful setting, the game creates opportunities for the sisters to share their knowledge and their aspirations to the staff members. At the same time, the game encourages the staff members to support, reflect, and add to the sisters' knowledge. We believe that this activity could be a small step forward in reducing the distance between the staff members and the sisters. And it could also support the sisters to use and further their assets while they are within the institution. Please note that we have not yet implemented this in the organization. These four methodological considerations deepen our understanding of assets and ways in which assets can be used to bring about individual and institutional changes. I will now move on to the final part of the talk, where I shall take a step back and reflect on some aspects of my work. Coming back to research question 1, we asked what conditions influence the sisters' lives in the shelter home. The sisters are beset by a variety of factors, including their own and the organization's deficit-based focus. We were able to locate some assets which formed the starting point of our engagement. This led us to undertake an asset-based approach, which required us to come up with a more precise definition of assets that fit our context. Further, we developed a framework that guided our action to bring about individual and institutional change. We sought to satisfy multiple goals within the limitations that were the realities of the ground. Factors such as the sisters' limited digital literacy and the turnover in the sisters group, the organization's limited resources, and our own limitations as actors, with limited understanding of the larger system and the limited time, influenced our exact strategies. But at the same time, so do the sisters' vision of a better future, their aspirations for technology, and their curiosity to learn and their pride in craft making, the organization's flexibility to engage in our incremental process, and their belief in the possibilities for the sisters, as well as our ability to bring in some resources to the setting, influence the direction of our engagement. In short, it is quite complex. Finally, in the research question, we asked how should we position ourselves so that the voices of the vulnerable are heard. Reflecting on our work, we find that we prioritize two things in our approach. First, we sought to build into the methods the values that we wanted to achieve at the end of our engagement. This included promoting comfort and control in the sisters' participation, supporting their agency by adapting participatory approaches, and by presenting the appreciative values which is embedded in asset-based design. Second, we believe that we needed to foster a space that allowed the participants to envision, enact, and experiment with their assets. In our work, this included supporting multiple perspectives to emerge through collective exploration. Building activities both on and off the screen was important in this case. The key takeaway message from this talk is that asset-based design can be a valuable approach when working with vulnerable communities, but it requires care. One of the elements of care is to present technology as a means to engage with assets and not as an end in and of itself. Technology was aspirational to the sisters. It was valued by the organization. And also our expertise is technical. All of this led us to a path that involved technology. However, at all times during the engagement, our emphasis was on their assets. Technology was explored as a means to reflect, amplify, and leverage the assets available to the population. Assets are embedded in the setting, and thus methods have to be adapted to the local condition in order to support critical reflection and use of those assets. This requires incremental steps. All the methods that we designed emerged incrementally based on our previous observations and engagements. This, we believe, is critical in asset-based engagement. The third and final element of care that I wish to discuss here involves committing to a long-term engagement. As highlighted earlier in the talk, asset-based design is a slow process of transformation requiring incremental steps. Further, the impact of the engagement is also difficult for the communities to assess, since it does not lead to, say, for example, immediate technological outcomes. All of these require us to support the community in trusting us and the process throughout the long-term engagement. As slow as the process of transformation may be, we believe that the opportunities for asset-based community engagement could lead to sustained change and are worth exploring further. To this effect, we've published and discussed some parts of our work that you can see here. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions and discuss this further.
Well done. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for general questions. We want to make sure to include faculty in that, and then we'll and maybe we have half an hour total for all questions, and then about half an hour to discuss with faculty. Okay, so you should run this, unless you want me to run it.
No, I'm good. I'm okay with running it. So yeah, anybody who has a question, like, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you're not comfortable, you can write it on the chat and I'll monitor the chat window as well.
I just wanted to say I'm a faculty at Department of English at Ph.D. My name is Sweta. Hi. I just want to say it's an incredible presentation, and thank you so much for inviting me and doing this incredible work. I look forward to learning more from you.
Thank you. Anybody has any questions?
Akash, I think Wendy has her hand up.
Oh yeah, Wendy, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Akash. That was incredible. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the piece about collective reflection you discussed. So it was in the middle of your presentation, but I'm really interested in how you saw like that collective reflection, and then how people were made comfortable to not share at certain points, and then also the limitations of doing collective reflection with like some of these vulnerable topics.
Yes, thank you. Like, I think from the beginning from the basics, right? Like, one of the decisions that we took early on was to discuss things about their present and their future. We avoided anything that touched upon topics that they would be uncomfortable with, and steps that come even before the research work, which I call like work before work, are quite critical. Like, for example, I would be present a week before the study began in the NGO, just to be physically present and seem familiar. And like, in passing, we'd hold informal conversations, just talking about things like, finding math to be difficult in schools, or like some of the Nepali music videos that have come up, or things like that, like casual conversation. And that helped promote comfort to some extent. And that translated in the space as well, right? Like, when I came into the space, I was not an outsider. Like, I was a friendly outsider, not a complete outsider. And that helped in promoting comfort in sharing some of the things. Now, we can't be sure whether they were completely comfortable in sharing like intimate details of the past. Me being a male does matter in this space. But in general, what we found was that they were comfortable sharing. Now, regarding collective reflection, part of the support came from the sisters' already existing mutual bond and the support that we'd seen in the setting. Like, they're working in craft, making local handicrafts in the afternoon, all days, like all 6 days of the week. Nepal has 6 working days, so 6 days of the week. And in those times, we noticed that they provided help to one another, and that translated here too. Like, at times when they were stuck or they did not want to share, somebody else posed a question that got the conversation started. I remember at one time when we were talking about crafting being difficult, somebody mentioned that, I don't want to talk about this first. And so I did not have to come in, but rather somebody else said, like, what is difficult for you there? And that kind of, support from within the peers helped a lot. And for me, like my role was to kind of take a step back and allow that conversation to emerge on its own with some structure placed here and there. That I believe was quite helpful. And that's why I believe, like, having multiple people to contribute and participate at their own level of comfort was really critical here. And especially, like, it's easy to ask someone what their needs are, right? But to ask what their assets are and to reflect on their strengths, it requires quite a, like, a level of comfort in the space for them to do so. And that came from their own support in the space. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Marisol, I see your hand up, so yeah.
Hi, Akash. It was great. I loved it. I have only one question that we've discussed this, but I wanted to know if maybe throughout your journey of writing dissertation and preparing this amazing presentation, if you have like changed or maybe like come up with a different way of looking at it. How do you think, is asset-based design different from participatory design, or what's the relationship there? What are we talking about when we say, or do we say asset-based, participatory design, etc.?
Thank you, Marisol. I mean, we've struggled with this question, right? Like, the way I think of it, and the way I've framed it in my dissertation as well, is I think of asset-based as this lens to go on in the field, right? In contrast to need-focused, where we look at needs and how much of the needs we are able to meet in our intervention. Here we emphasize assets. So that emphasis can happen in different ways. Like, for example, let's say you do an ethnographic study, right? Like, whatever you observe, you can look at, like, okay, people like let's take an example of the sister survivors in Nepal. Often the narrative there is that, they're from poor, marginalized families, and it is true, but they are helpless, they need support from external actors, and that again is true. But are we going to emphasize that? Or are we going to emphasize the agency that is already present to overcome this, enormous ordeal in the past that they have done, and the aspirations for the future that they hold now? So asset-based design provides this lens for us to emphasize the assets, the strengths, the positive, let's call the positive aspects of things in the setting, and as such can be applied to different methods. Now, participatory approaches are quite well aligned, like partly because, like, historically, they valued situated knowledge, like with metal workers in Scandinavia, right? And so, like, that there is already a belief that people hold the necessary knowledge to participate in the design process, and that's why we're involving them. So there is a close alignment with asset-based design. But having said that, like, other methods can definitely be applied as part of assets-based lens. We should discuss this further in our paper, Marisol.
Thank you.
Michael.
Hey, thanks, Akash. I think thanks again for a really nice presentation and your hard work on this important thing. And I think that with the population you studied, of course, already, this has been like really nice and hopefully very helpful work. But naturally, I do see some parallels between that population and then like your focus in the asset-based design on maybe like some other populations. And I'm wondering if you already have any first ideas of either factors of populations that might make them particularly beneficial when you're applying, asset-based design. And yeah, if you have any like favorite next steps where you hope to take asset-based design.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that question. There's quite, like, as I mentioned, like, there's quite a growing body of work within HCI. Like, Marisol is here, and she's done like incredible work in Atlanta with migrant families involved in wanting to be more involved in their their children's education in schools. There is Alexandra Cho's work, who looked at like low-income families in education setting to kind of support low-income families. Navina Karusala and Vishwanath et al. They looked at care practices in learning centers in Mumbai. Incredibly, all three have like learning component in there. But there's quite a lot of work that shows that asset-based design works in communities, even in communities where there are low resources. And like for me, like looking forward, I have few projects in mind where I want to kind of try assets-based design. As some of you may know, and others, I don't know, like I'm moving to San Francisco State University. And one of the problems that I've started discussing around is for women who were incarcerated and are trying to reintegrate back into society, and like exploring ways to support them in their kind of like reintegration into society, right? Like, so there's striking similarities, but also like different kinds of assets and different kinds of constraints there. And so one of the work that I hope to work in the future involves the women in this space. But yeah, like in short, I think there's quite a lot of potential in assets-based design, especially with vulnerable communities, if done with care. I see somebody's hand up, but I can't. Okay, Carlos, I see your hand up. Yeah, I think you're muted. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the presentation again. I think I agree with everyone else that the presentation was impeccable, and you are doing like a really good work on this field. I got one question. My question is regarding your own boundaries. So I think this is one of the most difficult things, at least for me as a researcher, trying to understand where my boundaries are. Like, what can I do, what I cannot do, definitely, where my actions are worth it and where my actions are not worth it. So I wanted to ask you about that process. Like when you are reflecting about your own work, do you have any difference between the boundaries that you initially think that you were gonna have versus what you ended up having?
Yes, thank you. That's such a nice question. And yes, like the boundaries changed. I think I was like progressively I was able to build a relationship with SO that kind of made me a sort of a friendly outsider who they could reach out to, and I could reach out to as well, which was not present there initially. To answer it, like to go dive a little deeper in this, I began in the initial study by reaching out to organizations. And when I reached out to them, like, partly because I said, like, I'm a computer science student at Virginia Tech, their expectation was around technology design. They valued technology and they wanted me to kind of design technologies for them right on off the bat. And so, like, being transparent about what our goals was, like, being in computer science and like learning about HCI work, we know that technology is often thought of as a charismatic solution to problems, right? Like techno-determinism, as well as Morgan Ames's work, through Morgan Ames's work. And we wanted to push back on that a little bit. And the way I thought of doing that was by being transparent about what our goals would be. So in the initial conversations, when they mentioned technology, I mentioned things like, let me first understand what the problem are and whether or not like technology is feasible. And and moving forward, we can think about technology. In fact, that was the reason why I could not build a relationship with one of the organizations, because their goals, their values, and our values did not quite match. Now moving forward, like, with SO, as I mentioned, that there was interdependency between the survivors and the organization, right? And that meant that we could not certainly usurp or like take over the organization's goals and just go on with our own agenda. It required careful goal balancing, and the way we did that was by being transparent about our next step. So every time when I was planning or thinking about the findings or the next step, I shared those with the staff members. We discussed what I had found, and the different approaches that they suggested first was included before thinking about the next step. Like Hamro Kala partly came forward because they mentioned technology in all of the suggestions after I had shared that I'd found assets and mutual bond as strengths from the first study. So that kind of transparency and being open to being open to sharing what we've found at all times, including like critical aspects like have the survivors feeling limited control, helped in like forming a better, like stronger bond as we moved forward. But it's a long process of like building trust. And this work is still ongoing. I believe I'll continue working in this with the organization in Nepal in the future. And hopefully the bond will keep on strengthening in the future. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Definitely. Yeah.
Can I add something to it though? I don't want to distract us too much, but as we move to forward, in some ways it was a gift to you that they were that they kept at a distance, because your problems have mostly been today overcoming the distance, right? But if they were perfectly trusting of you, then the bit would flip and you might have problems maintaining enough distance for the setting. And I think of this because when you first came to me with this project, the idea of sending a young, and if you'll forgive me, handsome man into this setting raised a lot of concern in me. You've negotiated it beautifully, I believe, but there are implications that we haven't had to go there, and I'm glad we haven't had to go there, right? But again, if going forward, that kind of boundary could present more of a problem.
Thank you for adding that. Yeah. Carlos, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else has any question?
I think we have time for one more question. And I want to make sure that all the faculty have a chance to pose questions publicly, although they can also pose them privately.
Yeah, I can ask a question. So it's kind of similar to the question that I asked last time. So yeah, I know when I think of it, like when I step back and then look at, think about the need-based approach, that's the goal, like, fulfilling the need, that's the goal. And then asset-based research is utilizing the resources they have. But behind the scene, I feel like there still should be a goal. And then, I mean, you made a nice transition from identifying the asset and then utilizing those assets to make them, approach to the technology. And then in the third study, that maybe mutual bond is there, but then one of the asset was gone, right? For example. So is that like, is this, maybe you could talk about the relationship between these two, the tension of these two, and then maybe the transition that needs to happen. Like, is it something inevitable, or is it all planned, or maybe you could have some reflection about it, the tension between those two approaches, and how are they related to each other?
Okay.
It doesn't sound like those two are like opposite from each other, like it's together, right? So could you talk a little bit more about it?
Okay. Sang, if I understand your questions correctly, first part, you want me to kind of reflect on assets and how it's related to needs, or how we conceptualize assets and needs. And the second part, like, take a reflection on how the progression that happened, that, in the third study where crafting seemed to be undermined a little bit. Am I getting your correct questions?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So in the first part, like, you're absolutely right. Like, just by emphasizing assets does not mean that the realities of the ground, including the limitations and the needs, are erased, right? Like, assets are valuable because they help either meet some needs or fulfill some aspirations that the population has. And that was what we came on to conceptualize and came up with the definition for that, where we talk about like satisfying multiple tensions that emerge from the needs, the structural limitations, as well as their aspirations, right? And partly because, like, assets are not all good and helpful, right? Like, for example, let's take crafting as an example, right? Like, one of the directions we could move forward with crafting could be and I've discussed this with you, was by providing them with the embroidery doing machines that could be programmed, and they could like automatically do it. There is value in it, like it would further their crafting practices. But hearing the sisters needs and desires to learn new things, and finding that they do not want to continue crafting further in the future, made us think about like other ways where crafting can be valuable but can lead to more enduring strengths once they leave the shelter home. That was part of the decision-making process when we moved to Hamro Kala. Now, on the second question, our approach was of discovery, and partly it came up because that was the reality in the setting. We went in at different times when the sisters group changed, and with it, the kind of assets that were available to them changed. Right? Navina argues about this in one of her papers, where she says, groups assets are available within the group may not be available to all the individuals too, and definitely it may not be available between different groups. And in our case, we had different groups. So it required care and consideration on whether those assets that we'd identified in our earlier study would be present in this study. So instead of like thinking about like certain approaches here and then going in and like being rigid about it, what we had in mind was, like, for example, in the third study was, we will begin by like seeing if Hamro Kala would be acceptable. And then if it is, we will think of expanding it forward towards a way that could enable, one, for them to learn about broader possibilities, and two, to think about how they can interact and engage with societal actors and institutions. Those were critical values for dignified reintegration, right? And so when we went in, we realized that the NGO had just received money from some another non-profit organization, which had enabled these group of sisters to join a morning school. Now, although they went only for the morning school, that experience of going to schools had changed their aspirations for the future, and also it impacted how they used computers, right? Like, for example, during the unstructured internet use time, they used it to learn about other primary aspirations. Now, when we asked them first what their aspirations were, they mentioned things like crafting or doing trekking guide training programs. But when the discussion moved forward, they shared things like wanting to become a veterinary doctor, or become a lawyer, or become a trekking guide trainer. So all of these, change in aspirations and change in what they value about computers emerges because of other experiences that are beyond our control. So that required us to be kind of be adaptive and adaptive to kind of go in and explore and discover and build on it incrementally. And that, I believe, because assets are very much embedded in the setting, I believe like this incremental approach to building on assets is quite critical, no matter in what context we work with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So what does it tell to future researcher, let's say, like a future researcher or like organization may want to engage vulnerable group, and then should they take your finding as do you think it will unfold in a different way for different vulnerable group, or should future researcher regard it as hey, destination is there at the end of the day, like this is where we want to go, and then this is just a way for them to make transition to the eventual goal that they want to accomplish? Or do you think it's that aspiration could be could unfold in completely different way? Like, being a lawyer in a society, it's or content is it's well aligned with the I don't know how to put it, like, what's successful in this, like what's portrayed as successful in society. So I wonder how other researchers should take from your long journey. I don't know if the question makes sense, but
what I understood was like whether there would be a similar replication in another context, and what researchers could get from this study.
Right. So should they have open agenda as you did, or like open-ended agenda like you did, or should they assume that, hey, this is the final destination, given that like behind the scene, the need and the deficit that they have is like something that you wouldn't find in the deficit-based research?
That's okay. That's such a thoughtful question, Sang. The thing I believe here is, I mean, there has to be incremental steps, but that does not necessarily mean that it's a completely open agenda. So like, in our case, as I presented, there was a framework of action that guided what was important in this setting, right? Like promoting critical reflection on the assets, supporting them to challenge some of the deficit perspective for them, like that they themselves hold and as well as others hold for them was important. Seeking ways for those assets to lead towards broader possibilities was important. And in our case, like especially given the settings, the particularity of the setting, there was a need to reduce the power differences so that they could themselves explore and explore and further their assets. These steps in the framework were quite critical, right? And that guided our action. It's just that within those actions, the approaches that we designed were adaptive. Because assets are very much embedded. So having that goal, how do we go on about fulfilling it? That needed adaptations in the setting, and that was important to us. Now, the other question about what could researchers gain from my work, I mean, I agree that there's quite a lot of specificity of the context in my work, and that's part of the process. Like, some of the approaches that work in this setting would not work in some other setting. But there's also some elements that I believe are of value. First, promoting comfort in their participation and providing control to reflect on assets is quite important. That we believe, supports in developing a critical awareness of the assets, right? Both its potential as well as limitations. That's going to be present in all the assets-based engagement that we want, because people often overlook some of the assets that they all have, right? Second, I believe as computer scientists or technology users, we're often go in thinking that technology may help. And I argue that technology should be a means. And a means for what? A means to kind of further their reflection and engagement that amplifies their assets. That's another critical thing that I hope that my work will convey, right? Third, I believe that there's a lot of mutual trust that's critical in assets-based engagement, right? It's a slow process. I don't think asset-based engagement will lead to immediate technological outcomes. Like if you know a need of the population, you can design something and bring it in, and that will be part of user-centered design or something like that. But here in this case, we do not asset-based does not lead to an immediate technological outcome, and that means it's difficult for community partners to kind of invest their time to engage with this process where they may not know what the outcome is, right? Like reflection on assets is not easy to measure as well. So how do we convince and earn their trust to go along with us in this journey of asset-based engagement? That is another thing. And in the dissertation, I highlight things like materiality and the narratives that was used, as well as building on familiar practices. All of those were quite critical in incrementally, slowly building trust. And it's not just about earning trust, right? You have to be true to that trust all the time. So that also involves activities in my case, after the COVID-19 lockdown, I started raising funds for the organization. Now that's not part of the research, but it's part of the relation building that comes with the establishing mutuality in the engagement. And all of those small steps that are that go beyond the research work are all important as part of asset-based engagement. And I believe that should be something that I hope can be something that comes out of my work and can be used in other contexts as well.
Thank you very much. I just thought that it could be maybe the whole approach could be misunderstood easily. So I just wanted to make sure how to prevent that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there are various different formulations of assets-based design. In fact, here I see Marisol here and here, and if I see somebody else, there's a few different ways of Neha has done asset-based approaches. There are few different ways of thinking about assets, asset-based design. And I think the critical element here is to kind of think about how we can identify and build upon assets and shape our methods to emphasize those assets that are available in the context.